the PCAM Podcast, recorded at Wave Studios, a sound design and mixing facility with a worldwide reputation for audio excellence. The PCAM Podcast. Hi there. Welcome back to another PCAM podcast, and today we're going to be talking about briefings, and we haven't even written any notes on this, so we're really just going to sort of dive in and have a bit of a free-for-all discussion. So apologies if we end up rambling, but I'm sure we'll be able to whip everyone into shape. I did have one note though, and that was the stalking horse.
The stalking horse,
which Tony was talking about earlier, and we thought it'd be a very nice sort of quite abstract Brechtian way to start off the podcast, but we're going to explain all now.
The stalking horse, what comes with, I mean, again, people when people are trying to brief music, because music is such an abstract and personal thing, it's quite difficult for agencies sometimes to give you a brief of any sort of meaningfulness, and they will say things like they want sort of something with a lot of power and passion, but a lot of softness with it, and the whole time they're also about sort of light and shade and chocolate and all sort of things that they don't really know what they mean, because until they hear something, quite often they don't know what they're actually after. So often when they do these briefs, they will give different companies different briefs. And again, if you're paid for doing these demos, it's one's more than happy to do such stuff. But they will give one company one brief and then a completely different brief to another company just to see what's going to come out of it. And so using stalking horses is one of the ways they try and narrow down what they're actually after in briefs. And again, I mean, if you're paid for doing it, then that is a fair and an honourable way of finding out what they want, because there's no reason why they should know what they want, and that's meant to be our job. So in that, you then need to go to someone like Augusta and give her a proper brief.
No, I was just going to say, you've basically just given a name to what I've always perceived as just that sort of muddling through bit at the beginning of a job, where then no one really knows what they want, and they're kind of just plucking at straws, really.
So yeah, I've been told once to have it feeling like it's closer but also further away. And I was like, would you like to come around and show me how to do that? Because that seems to be a little bit oxymoronic. But so yeah, it can be very confusing, the brief that people get. But then a lot of people can't talk musically very specifically about their briefs, so we need to use sort of adjectives and various other words.
I think there's nothing worse than somebody trying to talk technically musically.
I agree.
When they're nothing.
Yeah.
I'd much sooner establish from an agency, what are you trying to say, who are you trying to say it to, and how are you trying to say it, and then we can start from there. Because basically this is a language we all understand. There's not much room for error. You don't talk about volume when you mean tempo, or whatever it may be, and all of those silly things that we've all had experience of. But I also think one of the problems that we've got is that there is a fear of music, a natural fear, as Tony alluded to, and I think this is one of the reasons why so often people reach for a well-known pop track, because it means they don't have to talk about it. It's like, oh, well, it's Marvin Gaye, so we're cool. We don't have to chat with him. We got it there already. Yeah. And again, what we all know, and the elephant in the room here, is that very often, as we can all attest to, we're shown a rough cut of something that's been cut to an existing track, and we're told that they don't want to get sued. So, we know it, and we try and do what I think we know as a style alike, where you kind of think, one of the things I always think of is, if there's a track there, not how close to it can I get without getting sued, but if this was sitting as a CD on a shelf of CDs, what might be sitting next to it? What else would be on that shelf? Where can I go, rather than just alluding to that? And I have to say, when I'm given that kind of brief, I don't want to listen to it. I might listen to it once and then I just put it away, because I'm not slavishly copying it. It's there as a kind of an allusion to be alluded to, but having heard it once, and particularly if I already knew it, which I almost certainly did, I don't want to listen to it. What I want to do is to kind of get in the zone and try and approach it from a kind of area of music that I can attach some, and at the end of the day, doing something which is a copy of something that an agency couldn't afford to license is a rather sad excuse for creativity. What you really want is to give them something that actually feels creative and they feel proud of.
And we are going to do another podcast on sound-alikes later on, and we're going to talk more about the legal ramifications and how far you can push things, and why maybe you should try and persuade a client to go into another direction. But Tony, you've got something else to say about
I think
briefing?
it's very important when you take a brief not to be frightened, because so often when as a composer you get right and you're very excited suddenly, especially if you're a new composer and you haven't done a lot of work, and you get very excited by it, and you listen to what they say, and then you read the email, and then you sort of put it all down, and then you think, what the hell are they actually talking about? You mustn't be frightened of questioning people, and you should always, even if, because quite often you're briefed by a producer and not the creatives, and in those sort of cases you should always say, do you mind if I talk to the creatives, and then ring them up and actually discuss it with them, because you can often get so much more out of it if you ask questions of people, and even questions that you don't, might not seem relevant, but so that you can get a handle on what they want. So don't just take the first thing that's given to you.
Absolutely, I'd agree with that. And in fact, I think it's really important wherever possible to get a face-to-face meeting. And it saddens me that is increasingly difficult to do. But I think it's always worth pushing for, unless there are, very evident restraints. But yeah, face-to-face meetings I think are really important, and absolutely ask as many questions as you can. And I think I find actually that clients are... They don't tend to be too prescriptive these days in terms of the musicality of what you're doing, and it is obviously about conveying emotion and mood, and but let's face it, they always want something uplifting, really, don't they? Uplifting ending.
Unless it's a real parody of something.
Yeah.
Or something really sad and down.
Yeah. But yeah, you've got to just ask a ton of questions, and I think the other thing is, we've already touched on this, it's so subjective. And the number of times people say, well, we want something cool and contemporary, and you're thinking, okay, cool and contemporary, your idea of cool and contemporary, or my idea of cool and contemporary, or their head of marketing's idea. It's three completely different things. So the other thing I would suggest sometimes, once you've had that meeting, is to maybe send through some reference tracks of your own. I would never send just one track, because I would never be, for a moment, wishing to imply that we would be trying to do something close to one track. But it's more just to whether it gives you an opportunity to nail really maybe what someone's idea of cool and contemporary is.
Yeah, sort of like a mood board, isn't it? If you were doing designing something.
Yes, or if people are talking about genres, again, one person's idea of rock is completely different to someone else's.
I had that problem on a sort of short viral thing that I did, where he thought he wanted something very sort of John Williams-esque and very Indiana Jones, because there was a guy sort of like going through a jungle, and it turns out what he really wanted was something more Hans Zimmer and Dark Knight.
Yeah.
I ended up having to rewrite the track overnight, because I got to the end of the day and he was like, no, this isn't what I want it more punchy and more sort of like taiko drums and stuff, and I was like, oh no, you want something more sort of Hans Zimmer and modern. So I think it is really important to try and find some references, perhaps, as a sort of like mood board for what you want to do.
To be honest, it's probably, apart from actually being able to follow through with the job and be able to deliver music that people would want to listen to, that's fundamentally the most important quality to have as a composer for applied music. The ability to be able to dissect that brief and work out what it actually is that they want, and just be able to communicate on that level. And I think a lot of music companies fall down on this, because there's no communication, or there's inadequate communication with the actual composers. So there's not only is there the potential for a blockage in the advertising agency, you only talk to the producer. In a music company, you can actually, again, only talk to a producer. So the people, the creative at the advertising agency and the creative composer are never communicating directly, ever, which is a recipe for disaster, in my opinion.
Unless you work with
I would say that there's a little thing that I do, and it's interesting. I don't know how different people work. It's interesting to find out. But one of the things, if I've given a fairly open brief, I think one of the really important things to do if you're working in advertising is establish an ideal tempo. And the way I tend to do that is I watch a film, when I get it, silent, just with a metronome. And obviously, if it works at 150, it's going to work at 75, but it will equally work at a number of different tempos. What I like about that is that when you establish the tempo that feels best, you've actually made a lot of decisions about the film without establishing anything about style or what you're actually going to write. You've established what you feel the important cuts are, the things that have to be hit really hard, the things that you can kind of wash over slightly more sort of subliminally. You've made a lot of actual decisions, editorial decisions about what is significant in that film that you feel you need to address without having to go musically close to it.
I'll tell you what you've probably also established is you've also established what the editors cut to.
Well,
and therefore
possibly,
you'll
yes.
have established the tempo that the people in the room are probably used to seeing. And so actually if you deviate from that, you're often already having the potential to slightly miss their expectations.
Absolutely. I mean, I did a track last week which ended up, the tempo was 158 beats per minute, which, you know,
it's pretty fast.
That's fast.
So does anyone have anything else to say?
Is this the time to sort of mention the more businessy side of briefs, taking briefs?
Yes.
In that it's, again, really important to get paper trails to these things. So in terms of a brief, you know, you want an email saying what it's for, saying where it's going to be played out, what the territories are. You want purchase orders, order numbers, anything that gives you a proper, because so many people will go ahead and do a job when it's just word of mouth between two people and you don't really know what power they have in the agency or don't have in the agency. So it's very important to make sure before you actually kick off and start on a job that you have proper authorization to do it, and therefore there'll be no trouble later on when it comes to them paying it.
I would also add that you need to be very aware of who you're taking your brief from. We've had instances where we've been told to get the brief from the director, and knowing the industry as we do, we've said that's great, we'd love to have a brief from the director, but we would like to speak to the creative team too, because at the end of the day it's the agency who will be licensing the track and paying our fees. And actually one of the most awkward situations that you can get yourself in is to have these two briefs separately. Everyone needs to be in the room at the same time, because if they're not, you end up with two briefs and you can satisfy neither if you try to.
The broth, and then
it's fine if you're all in the same room and then they can thrash it out and Godzilla versus King Kong.
The Swamp Thing.
Yeah, and hopefully you come out of the room with half a clue where to go.
The last thing you want to do as well is end up with something which is a compromise between two different sort of styles.
It does happen
desires,
quite often, that thing with too, when you get the client there as well. So you have the client who got one idea, the creators have another idea, the producer or the director has another idea, and often in those circumstances it is, I mean, it's entirely up to how people want to work, but it's often worth doing maybe 2 demos for somebody on the basis of trying to satisfy, because you don't know who's got the actual power in this operation.
Yeah.
And sometimes you think the power is held by the agency, it's actually held by the client, and sometimes you think the power is held by the director, but it's actually held by the creative in the agency. So it's a minefield that you have to work your way through, and obviously experience helps you do this. But it's worth in some circumstances, I think, giving 2 different approaches to something.
Yeah, and I would also say that I personally think there can be a case for going off brief entirely. However, it is a dangerous road to tread unless you are certain to be also submitting something that is on brief. I think it's great to give some kind of complete curveball, but you have to demonstrate that you can meet a brief too, otherwise they ain't coming back to you, because that's too scary if they're paying for that.
No, that's true. That's something that I find slightly easier to do, perhaps when writing for films, than something short. You might be able to say, I know you wanted this for like the end of this film, but why not try something a little bit different? And
sure.
sometimes I send that first before what they asked for, and they actually go, oh, actually, no, that is what I want.
You know, like
I can see why. So it is always important to try and be confident in what you believe is going to work best narratively for the project, because actually you might have an idea they haven't had. So
yeah, and actually that reminds me of one other point, which is that you should always ask to be sent anything to do with the music brief and the scripts and the storyboards and the treatment and everything before the meeting, and if possible the film, because that way you can go in with some creative ideas to throw at it. Although I would also caution to listen to their ideas before you blurt out yours, because that can be a bit of a trap otherwise.
Very wise. Chris, do you have a Sally?
Sally,
do you want to
I just wanted to add to the point about meetings. Often I think composers will be working freelance and they'll be working through music agencies and won't get the chance to be in the meeting at all, and will be taking a brief from the music agency. And I'd just say to them, please feel comfortable with that agency, feel comfortable with what they're asking you to do, feel comfortable asking questions, the same questions that you'd ask the client. If they can't answer it, or they don't want to, or they're unresponsive, just don't work for them. Please don't.
Well,
good.
I would say
advice.
Yeah,
Good
I would
advice.
say also one thing. It's interesting. There was a campaign blog which Dave Trott does quite regularly, and the latest edition of that was on owning a dog and barking yourself. And I think that something else to remember is that the reason you're called in is because you're the professional expert in this field. Now, people have ideas. And, it's true if they're, he who pays the piper, etc., etc. It's fine that you address their ideas and respect their ideas and go to it. But, don't be afraid of having an opinion, because at the end of the day, you are the expert, and that's why they called you in. And if you're just slavishly following, if I'm employing somebody to do something I can't do, like a website or one of the million things I can't do, I'll tell them kind of where I want to go and then let them go to where they want to be, because this is the limit of my understanding of what can be done. So if you've got any better ideas, please tell me what they are. And I think, if you've got a good relationship, you should be able to have that conversation.
And some of the best branding and some of the best adverts have a very idiosyncratic sound. When you hear that piece of music or when you hear that sound design, you know immediately what that company is or what that advert is. And if it's sounding very generic and like something else that they've already chosen, then it's not in their advantage. So they're always happy to hear that. They might not necessarily go for it, but you should always take that advice on board, I think. Now, we're starting to reach the end time of what is a normal PCAM podcast so far. So unless anyone has any other points to make, we're going to wrap it up there. As always, we'd like to say a massive thank you to Wave for allowing us to record the podcast in their facilities. And you can tweet PCAM and Wave and maybe say wave to wave, hashtag wave to wave, which is the new meme, which I'll be saying at the end of every podcast because I think it's funny, and they're still laughing. They won't be by the end of this. And we'll see you next time.
The PCAM Podcast.